Good day and welcome to Wake Forest University's Center for the Study of Capitalism, latest webcast on the future of capitalism. Today, we're going to be doing a program called Doing the Right Thing, How Companies Lead in the New Age of Diversity and Inclusion. I'm Richard Levick, and let me introduce you to our panel. With us today, Doree McAlpin, Senior Vice President at Levick, who heads the litigation department, and she also directs the firm's diversity and inclusion activities. Doree, welcome to the program.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Doree. Bill Ide, an old friend, a partner with the law firm of Ackerman, formerly served as general counsel to Monsanto. Also, you were the president of the American Bar Association and currently sit on the board at Clark Atlanta University. Bill, welcome.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Neil Foote. Neil, it's great to see you again. Neil, who has his own public relations firm, is also the president of the National Black Public Relations Society and a principal lecturer at the University of North Texas's Mayborn School of Journalism. Neil, I don't know if Wake Forest allows people from other universities on their programs, but we're delighted to have you today.
I'm glad to be part of the panel and glad to be welcomed by Wake Forest in this discussion.
We'll see if we can get some t-shirts and sweatshirts out of this later from them. Kurt Bardella, welcome to the show. Kurt, you were just brought on by the Lincoln Project as a senior advisor. You sit on the board of contributors to USA Today and are a regular contributor to multiple television networks, including MSNBC. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on.
And you have the best location in Sonoma. So we're all, if we could travel, we would all be there shortly. Chris Jackson, a senior vice president with Ipsos, who's an expert on American elections and public polling. Chris, great to have you. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's great to be with everyone.
Chris, why don't we start with you, with your background in polling both nationally and globally. Can you set the table for us? Where are we right now? What do you see out in the marketplace?
Yeah, certainly. So Ipsos is a global market and public opinion research company. We're in the field multiple times each week doing public opinion research. I run our US practice, public opinion practice. So we're really keeping our fingers on the pulse of the American zeitgeist in a number of ways. And I really want to highlight three trends that I think really explain this moment in American history and really what the private sector is facing. The first trend is that Americans are overwhelmingly pessimistic about the direction of the country. They are by a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 ratio, thinking that the country is going off on the wrong direction. They have very negative views of almost all of the institutions of American society. And that really starts with the executive office and the president and really goes all the way down. And that really feeds into the second major trend that I want to point out, which is this long-term decline in trust among Americans towards much of the public sector. And that really includes quasi-public things like reporters in the news media, includes pollsters, unfortunately, and any sort of number of other institutions that Americans are just not trusting. And I think that's as a result of a series of failures that have cumulatively sort of diminished the capacity, diminished the trust that people have in all of these elite actors. But the one exception to that is really the private sector writ whole. The public still actually has a lot of trust for various parts of corporate America, of the business sector, particularly of small businesses. Small businesses remain, sort of on a golden hill. And I think that is sort of the opportunity here is as the public is seeing the public sector not able to do the jobs they want to do, they're turning to the private sector, they're turning to business to sort of pick up the slack. And that's really one of the major forces that we're seeing right now, driving a lot of the activism, driving a lot of the push for companies to mobilize, to take very public stances on social issues, is because the public really doesn't expect the government to do it anymore. But the third thing, and this is the thing that I think makes most important, is there's been a real democratization of information in American society with the information technology revolution, then with social media. It used to be that if an organization controlled the 3 or 4 major channels, a couple of newspapers, you would be able to control what people knew or understood about you, but that's no longer true. Now, any one of millions of people could at any moment have something that they say or think or feel or find out go viral and all of a sudden become a story about an organization. And in that democratization of information, it's much more important for a company to say and do the same things. You can't really say one thing and do something else anymore because there's too many eyes on organizations. And if that happens, if you're found to be saying one thing and doing something else, that's when you see real crises of trust in these organizations, and you see reputations really come apart.
Kurt, last time, if memory serves me correctly, last time we saw these kinds of negative numbers in terms of the direction the country was heading goes back to 1980 when Jimmy Carter was running against Ronald Reagan. As an expert in the reading the tea leaves in politics, how do you see the coming election in terms of what businesses need to be thinking and doing?
Well, I think that one of the key things, and Chris has already touched on this, the level of distrust that exists from the American people in its fundamental institutions is at an all-time high. And that's driven in part by the complete failure of the federal government to adequately address the coronavirus. We're seeing that it's just getting worse and worse every day. More than 130,000 Americans have lost their lives, and there seems to be no end in sight. We see this onslaught of attacks against the media driven by the Trump narrative of fake news, which has polarized the media to the point where people get different things from different media sources, and facts and science become partisan. The whole debate over whether wearing a face mask in the time of Corona makes you more likely to be a Democrat or Republican. The fact that that's actually a thing tells you how fractured the consumption of information has gotten and how toxically politically polluted it's become. All the while, the dark sentiment, the fact that when you look at any polling right now, is the country on the right track, going in the right direction or wrong track? It's upside down right now. People are not optimistic right now about the direction of our country, and they're concerned about what that future means for them. And anytime that things are that bad, that almost always points to a change election, that whoever is in the incumbency is going to lose. And I think that that's pretty much the trajectory that we're headed right now. When things aren't going well, people believe it's much easier to pull the lever and make the case to make a change in leadership. And the problem with Donald Trump that's so tough, I think, for him is he has spent his entire presidency literally making everything about him. And when you do that, it gets a lot harder to deflect responsibility when things go wrong, to say that it's other people's fault, when the entire time, all you do every day on Twitter, during rallies, at press conferences, he just singularly makes everything about himself. And I think that the 4 years of doing that now are going to come back on him, and he will be held responsible in November by the voters for things going so poorly right now, not just with the pandemic, but with the economy. This is one of those rare times where what's going on in the country, every single person is impacted by this pandemic. And it's so different than other things that we have seen happen and other controversies, whether it's isolated issues like what's going on at the southern border, whether it's nuclear war with North Korea. Those things are don't touch every single person in their everyday lives. But here we're confronted with the question of, do we send our kids to school? Is it safe to do that? Going to the grocery store is an entire checklist of things that you have to do now, the everyday things. And once those everyday things that Americans so oftentimes take for granted are disrupted, that usually leads to political change.
Neil, before the show, we were talking about 1998 and the beginning of the National Black Public Relations Society and what some of the need and desire for change was back then. And you gave a terrific historical view. And I was hoping that you could share that now that we're live, and also address the question some people ask, with the Black Lives Matter movement, is this just a moment in time? And I know you and I have talked about before, this is a historic moment. This is not something that's going to pass. And I think if you could talk about that and the importance of change, that would be terrific.
Definitely, Richard. Yeah, we are at this confluence of two major cultural changes in this country, in part fueled by the COVID-19 pandemic, and now by the racial and social injustice that we're kind of seeing play out before our eyes. That kind of Chris laid out, that we're in a world where the democratization of content means that everyone who has a cell phone now is a publisher, and content can be used, shared instantly to tell a story. Back in 1998, Pat Tobin, a hugely experienced public relations professional who had her own agency, saw what was happening with Toyota at the time, and their interaction, or lack of interaction, of marketing and their efforts to the African American community. She was able to land a significant contract with that company, but it also brought to focus the issue that there were so few Pat Tobins in the world that were available to do this kind of work, not only as independent agencies, but also those working at major agencies and those working within corporate structures. Pat created Beepers, the National Black Public Relations Society, with a handful of others around the country who really drove forward this issue that we needed diverse voices to tell the stories of any number of individuals in this country, but also create a platform where we could get equity and access as Black public relations professionals, not only to jobs, careers, and contracts that could help tell that story. I would love to say that fast forward some 20 years that the industry, the public relations industry, has changed in terms of its diversity. I'm proud to know some of the many African-American executives who've risen through the ranks and are at senior positions at some of these companies. Sadly so, though, that number probably can fill a small conference room in the C-suite level. And that kind of progress now is brought into focus right now with every company in this country. And I think what we have in this dialogue is how we can change the way we talk about race and diversity in this country and make significant impact in that without any barriers to the fact that we need to bring it up in the room, and it needs to be discussed, and it needs to be addressed at the highest levels. And I'm sure we'll go a little bit deeper into that as the discussion goes on, but I wanted to set that up for our conversation today.
Neil, I'm sorry. I've always wondered something, and I think you're perfectly positioned to answer this. People like me who work in the political world in Washington, we always, we watch commercials and we see ads and we go, how did anyone let that go through? I think back to the very famous, I think it was a Super Bowl Pepsi commercial with one of the Kardashians that got ridiculed because the spot was, a situation with, I think, law enforcement, and there was racial tensions, and she crosses the line and hands a Pepsi to someone, and all of a sudden it's kumbaya. And I couldn't help think to myself, if a person of color had been in the room when that spot was pitched, they immediately would have said, that's a terrible idea. You're going to get pillared for that. Why is there such a lack of that awareness, in that public relations, corporate communications world?
Well, the phrase, you got to be in the room where it happens, is a little overused now, maybe. But it's exactly that point, that there's a complete lack of realization that diversity is beyond just kind of a feel-good moral issue. It's a business issue. Pepsi got banged up in a big way that way, and other companies have launched campaigns that suddenly they've looked back and say and had to revise and retract and apologize, when in fact the changes start right now. When you have diverse folks in the room, that gives the opportunity to have conversations and raise questions that help us think one more time. Is that the right thing to do? Is that the best approach? And how can we do it better? And so, Kurt, your point is, I don't know how many times I've banged my head up against the wall with my friends and colleagues who say, wow, how come no one missed this in a world in which we live today, where media is so accessible, so available, so blatant when it comes to what should be the good approaches and what should be avoided at all.
Mm-hmm.
So Neil, I'm going to run the next question to Doree, but a quick one for you. Here we are at this historic moment. Between 12 and 26 million people have taken to the streets as part of the BLM and New Civil Rights movement, making it the largest series of demonstrations in the history of the United States, dwarfing the anti-Vietnam War protest. Is your phone ringing off the hook?
It
It
should be
has
ringing.
been. There have been a lot of issues. I think the chicken has come home to roost, and I think the problem it goes to what the problem that Kurt mentioned, as well as the history that Neil outlined. Diversity and inclusion has been treated like the kids' table. You know, if you have a person of color appointed in a position and you have the right statement on your website, you figure, you know, you've done your work. And that's no longer good enough. Companies are being called out every day for glaring disconnects, credibility issues, where they're not walking the walk, where leadership has absolutely no idea of what's going on in their organizations. It happens every day. It's also just about not listening and being in tune to the issues that people of color have been talking about for decades, but voices have been unheard. So, you know, we're facing a time where people have had enough, and where NDAs will no longer stop people from speaking out on issues and basically airing their dirty laundry for everyone from corporations and companies around the world.
Non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, and I know.
Yeah.
Doree, we don't want our legal education to go to waste. So, Neil, you were going to respond to that question as well.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think this is a moment, right, that it finally has connected to many people. Is my phone ringing off the hook? Maybe a little bit more on some of these issues. A lot of these have been conversations where and not necessarily transactions. There are a number of columns that have been written about this, but any number of Black folks I know have received the call to be the person on the panel or the person to provide confidential advice to senior executive friends of ours. And it's, there was a great column, I forget where I saw it this past weekend, that kind of said, yeah, that's good. I value that expertise because I've lived it. Growing up in Bed-Stuy during the 1960s, I lived and saw a bunch of stuff that have helped shape my view of the world and some of those protests and riots and unrest that took place there. But I think this is certainly an opportunity to say that if we want, real change, if we really want to believe that we can have an impact, that you need resources, financial resources, and you need talent, and that's people and expertise who can shed light to these issues every day, not only from at all levels of the organization, right up to the C-suite and the boardroom.
Doree, let me ask you one more question before I turn it over to Bill. What do companies do who do want to do the right thing, but they're handcuffed by their history? It's, 50 years ago, 75 years ago, they did things that they didn't get a lot of attention for at the time, but it's in their history, and there is a fear factor that inhibits them from being more outspoken now.
Well, there's a huge opportunity now, especially now, for companies to take a look at their history and also look at the connect the dot risk. Because while, you want to do the right thing, maybe the company's history or political connections or political contributions create a disconnect with, what they're supposed to do. But it's beneficial for companies to basically take a red team approach and to take an outside look in, objective look into all of the vulnerabilities in the organization, from the board down to the lowest level of the organization, vendor relationships, to conduct an assessment of where they stand and where there might be issues that either create a litigation risk or a reputational risk.
And when you're talking about red team, you're talking about people from outside the organization who are operating confidentially, but are looking deeply into the company, including its history, not with rose-colored glasses, but with a magnifying glass and the desire, let's be critical and make the best determination about ourselves so that we can go forward thoughtfully rather than just trying to continue to brush it under the rug.
Yes, exactly. It's the unvarnished truth, because the challenge a lot of organizations face, global organizations with great records of diversity and inclusion, we find that people that work for an organization are sometimes, they hesitate to speak up. I was in a boardroom with a global organization. They had, progressive person charged with diversity and inclusion. But when I raised some of the difficult questions, just about the election, about what the organization's position is on certain issues, that person was silent. They were surprisingly silent. While they were really vocal on a one-on-one call, they didn't say anything. And, that's where there's difficulty, because in most cases, people are afraid to speak up because either their voices are unheard, either not understood, they are afraid of repercussions, and, there's, often backlash. So if you have someone that's able to step in and take a 360 of the organization and provide findings, we find that it's really helpful to close some of those gaps and provide a better understanding of the vulnerabilities.
Thank you, Doree. Bill, you've been terrifically patient. I've known you for a lot of years, and I'm sure that you won't be billing us for those 20 minutes where you weren't commenting. So what are you recommending? I know, you've been in this leadership position for many years. What are clients asking you? What are companies asking you who are saying, well, we want to change, but we don't know how? What are you recommending?
Well, part of it's education. Now, I got my education when I was general counsel of Monsanto, and we fought the GMO wars throughout the globe. And so I learned a lot about publics and communications. But here's what I say to boards. The future of capitalism. Well, in the agrarian area, the capitalism was a trust because everybody lived together and you better do it right or they're not going to come to your store. So it was fairly easy. The Industrial Revolution sort of changed the ball game because it became very impersonal, and finally society had enough of that, and you had the tumultuous time in the early 1900s, which led to very similar to where we are today, where the public said enough is enough. So you got the antitrust laws, you got the child labor laws, you got the women's suffrage laws, you got tax laws, tremendous change that business never would have done except it was demanded by their publics. And so future capitalism always has to be, what's the social contract with your publics? And what are the expectations of your publics? After the Depression, business was much more regulated because of the SEC rules, because they saw the great abuses that occurred. So we went through that. Peter Drucker warned us coming into the 21st century that, and he didn't say it this way, but the technology revolution has now changed the game again. And the point's already been made. Everyone knows everything now. You can't hide. There can be a video of a policeman's abusing someone. You'll see that. And the democratization of information, everyone knows that. So what I say to boards is, your social contract is by the public. You have to listen. And so when all of a sudden cyber became a big thing and privacy became a big thing, that's the start of it. And climate change, there's an evolution now into, at the board level, we talk about ESG, environmental sustainability governance. The explosion we've just now had is we hadn't seen a pandemic, and we were terribly ill prepared. And then the explosion that we've had here on racial injustice is, it's been there, it's been latent, the point's been made, there's been sort of lip service, but there's never a deep understanding at the boards and at the C-suite what the issues are. And that's where we are now. And the critical thing for companies is, if you want to do the right thing, it's very challenging because you got to be willing to listen and learn and be educated. And what we're working on now is, well, one other point. Communities now are no longer agrarian, but they are companies. and some are global companies, and therefore they're global communities. But the impact that business can have of listening to society and meeting their needs. My thesis is after the COVID situation, when we come out the other end, there are going to be winners and losers. Which businesses build a lot of trust because they bent over backwards to do the right thing. Same thing is going to happen on racial inequality, in my belief. One, I think boards need to understand that this is real. Racial injustice and inequality is very real, and you don't understand it, you've got to get deep, and you've got to listen to the people. I'm on the board of an HBCU, and one of the things I'm urging them to do is they can be the intellectual force because they've got the lenses and the perspectives that other institutions don't have. They have students and they have faculty and they have alumni that have lived with us for so long. And the stories you hear, a general counsel told me recently that a neighbor called the police because there was a black man in their backyard. Well, he was in his backyard, the general counsel's backyard. And how could this be? And so it's real. Companies cannot stand on the sidelines. The publics are not going to stand for that. And then the real challenge is we have to find a way to get safe space to have the discussions within the companies. And that's very challenging. I had one general counsel say, well, we had an affinity group of Black employees. They were very raw discussions. But it was very helpful. And a white C-suite person listened in and said, well, let's take that the whole company. And she said, we're not exhibits. That was authentic, but we don't run around and express our feelings. So there's a lot of work to be done to figure out how do you do that, and then the education. But it's going to happen. And Richard, I also think that boards are going to have to change their thinking. They're going to have to be real transparent of their commitment, and they're going to need to be audited. And of course, we love that because what I do and you do. But we did financial audits for years. This is more important in many ways than financial audits are, in my view.
I just wanted to chime in, Bill, because thanks for the insight. I was just doing some research several months ago about boards and diversity, and was coming across some concerning data. And I wonder if you've heard any of this of some boards just being fatigued with this whole diversity issue and not seeing it as a priority. And I was wondering if that is in fact a trend, and whether what's going on in the world today maybe will help trigger the reality that we've got to be more corporately responsible about these issues.
Well, I think it's very much like the virus, that in the way this country is divided, who listens to the science and who's saying, I'm weary, I don't want to talk about that. There are those that see how serious it is on racial injustice, but there are a lot still that have been in their bubble and they're not educated. And so it's going to be a struggle. But I think I'm going to give you one quick example. When I was president of the American Bar, I pushed for prison reform 20 years ago because that was the right thing. I got nowhere. And then the conservatives moved for prison reform because it was a great financial tool to save money. And so there's going to be a mixed discussion on racial. I think it's the right thing to do, but also it's the smart thing to do if you really want to be part of a society and have credibility and trust. And so that debate's going to go on. But I think the leaders will show the way. And those are the companies that then all of a sudden will set the trend. That's my hope. The last thing I'll say is the same debate goes on versus shareholder value versus stakeholder value, that there's still those that say the only thing that counts is stock price. And I don't want to see any expenditures for anything longer term, like dealing with COVID and more extensively, prevention, like racial injustice. And that battle has to be waged, but I don't think society will settle for less. And that's when I'm saying there'll be winners and losers.
Chris, where do you see all
and
this?
I know Bill might.
Neil, you're cutting in and out on this, so let me move the question over to Chris, and then let's pick up on your point when we're sure you're connected. Chris, you've talked about the fact that there is a change in corporate citizenship, and Bill's touched on that. How do you see that in the marketplace? And does any of your research indicate whether or not you think that shareholders are willing to take a longer view rather than the next quarter?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there is a change that's sort of undergoing, and part of it is the roles people see themselves playing in society, and part of it's the rules that are underwriting everything, and it's the interaction between the two, right? So, we see this current round of activism, corporate activism, and a lot of it's actually being driven by the employees of these organizations who are demanding that these businesses change the way they're doing things. The customers are certainly driving it to an extent, but a lot of times it's the employees that are sort of really agitating for it, and that's one of the stakeholders. You have to, you can't function as a successful business if your employees are just refusing to sort of follow the company's line. And that's one of the things businesses are having to figure out how to manage. And I think Bill had a great sort of way of thinking about it is shareholder versus stakeholder value, and that American businesses have really been very focused on shareholder value for a number of years and have essentially offloaded costs onto society. But now with all of the eyes on businesses now, like I mentioned before, with everyone, being a tweet away from going viral, companies are having to take more responsibility for those costs in a way that they didn't have to a generation ago. And that's part of having a broader understanding about how your business operates and what you're doing in society. But that's not necessarily just on the negative side of the ledger. It's not just cost. There's also benefits that you can recognize as a business, promoting communities, getting goodwill. There's value to goodwill. There's value to having trust. There's value to having positive equity with society, and businesses really need to take all of that into account moving forward. And I think the fundamental battleground right now isn't necessarily a battleground about big gestures. It's not a battleground about making big states. This is really sort of what Neil and Bill have been sort of referencing. It's a battleground about changing the fundamental structures and rules that are governing the system so that all of these changes get baked into how things operate. So when this moment fades, when people are less outraged about the killing of George Floyd, when people move on to whatever the next thing is, the system has already been redesigned to support these changes and keep them moving over time so that they don't just fade away once attention fades away.
Kurt, I saw you shaking your head and thought you'd want to jump into the fray here.
Yeah, I think what Chris brings up is an important point, that it's easy to be proactive in the moment, in the heat of the moment. And obviously, with what we've seen with George Floyd, the protests, and the inflammatory rhetoric coming out of Washington, social justice, racial justice is one of the top two issues in this country right now. I'm always interested in, well, what happens next? What happens when Donald Trump perhaps no longer in office, which could happen, in 110 days from now? Where does the conversation go? And I think that as people and companies begin to think about how they're going to recalibrate internally for addressing these social issues, I think they need to also think about what that's going to look like a year from now, 2 years from now. It's not good enough to just do something here and now and really have we're going to check the box and it's kind of tokenism approach to dealing with social justice and diversity. There's got to be institutional and an infrastructure internally built up to support these type of initiatives in the long term. It's easy to cut a check to a social justice fund in George Floyd's memory and then move on. But if we're going to have the change that I think that people on the ground are clamoring for, it's going to have to go much deeper than that. And there's kind of that trap, and we kind of saw this with the election of President Barack Obama, that we elected our first Black president. I think society collectively took a sigh of relief and said, "Okay, we've begun to exercise the demons of our country's past. We fixed racism in America because we elected a Black president. Hooray for us!" And we never heard a conversation about social justice ever again. And then all of a sudden, President Trump comes into office, and racial tensions ignite in this country, and we're having these conversations right now. But what does that conversation look like if we have a President Joe Biden? So I think it's important for these companies and these CEOs and the C-suite world to look at things not just through the lens of the here and now when tensions are high and emotions are high, but what will that look like in a post-Trump world?
And Kurt, President Obama famously shared how he felt constrained and wanting to keep his presidency within very conservative guardrails. And compared to where we are today, I think he was aware of his own glass ceiling, even as America was patting itself on the back.
Yeah, and the way that President Obama approached social justice issues, I mean, again, it's the same dilemma I think that people of color feel now in the professional world. If you're asked to be the head of diversity for NBC Universal, there is a way that you internally look at that where you don't want to just be the token, person of color, that has this only in name position that has no real authority, no autonomy, no infrastructure, no resources, but you also want to try to do what you can to change the environment that you're in. And it's an internal struggle, I think, for a lot of people of color. I mean, just in the media industry alone, where I see every day the push that people of color have to try to get airtime, to be on an equal playing field with their white commentators, how white commentators are given certain freedoms and leeway rhetorically that people of color really aren't. I was talking to a commentator who's been off television for the last 5 months because of a comment he made about the Bernie Sanders campaign. And and there is nothing that this person said that comes anywhere close to rhetoric we've seen from other commentators who happen to be white. It's a real dilemma. But on the flip side, we're also seeing major changes at MSNBC and NBC. The new head of the network is an under 50-year-old Hispanic named Cesar Conde. The fact that that person is now in charge of NBC is something we would not have thought of 4 years ago would have been even possible. And we found out today that he has made a permanent position of having a person in charge of diversity for talent booking. He's made the pledge that he wants all staff to be more 50% diverse. There's no timetable on that, but it's still a marker that he has set and that he will be judged by. And so those are the type of changes that we're seeing, but also at the same time, the type of conflicts that we're seeing as well. And I think President Obama in his presidency, lived that in real time in front of all of us as he tried to wrestle being a person of color, but also being the president for the whole country and how to reconcile those things.
Bill, I saw you wanted to chime in.
Richard, what I wanted to talk about is the root causes for the racial inequality. And I think that's where companies can, if you live in Atlanta and the north side, which is the affluent side, you'll live 13 years longer than you live in the south side. It's criminal. And so we're talking to, and I'm trying to get Clark AU to start doing projects, but talking to the corporate community, because it's all about prevention. And if you go in and educate people about the chronic diseases, there's a program. One of the problems is we do distance learning in the school systems. The lower socioeconomic people suffer greatly because they don't have computers. They don't have someone at home that can help coach them along. So we've got to get to and then in housing. If you affluent, you can live in a zip code where you got a great school. If you're not, you don't. And those things, that's where corporate America has to start exposing, because you talk about change, you've got to get the fundamentals, and it's health, and it's education, and it's housing, and it's income equality. And so some of that's policy, but a lot of it is just rolling up your sleeves. There's a great program in Atlanta right now where obesity is a huge problem for Black women in high school. And there's a lot of complications why, but there's some solutions if you'll get out. So that's where the corporate community needs to throw in and try and help. But that's one of the things I'm hoping boards will do is, what can I do in my community? What can I do policy-wise if I'm, I've got a good public affairs? And then what can I do meaningful? Because you got to get to the root causes.
Therese, what do you do when you're working with clients, and there are probably two kinds of clients: those who don't want to change, maybe three, I guess, those that embrace change and are really willing to take the risk, and that's probably the smaller number. Those that really don't want to change or want to limit it, and those that do want to change but are blind to the kinds of changes, no matter how many conversations you have with them about what's necessary. How do you handle those personalities?
It's a challenge overall, because
I wanted to give the easy questions for you.
A lot of organizations, especially leadership ranks, they think they're doing the right thing. They might have represented people in communities of color. It's like, oh, because I represented this figure, then, we do the right thing. But they have a lot of issues internally. So it's a process. It's something that won't occur overnight. A lot of organizations think that these issues can be resolved overnight. Like, oh, I wrote a great statement, so why didn't it go away? So it really takes a commitment and a process. It all starts with leadership and seeing who has a seat at the table, not the kids table, the diversity and inclusion table, which often does not have full power. But who has a seat at the table, and what's the accountability? What is the desired end game? Not for right now to make a bad tweet go away, but the end game, a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, and looking at the communities that you serve and that you work in. So it's really taking a moment to look inward and working through a process and getting organizations to take an honest look. And it's really easier said than done. They really have to want to make that commitment. And more often than not, it usually requires pain for that to take place. If you look at some of the bigger brands like a Coca-Cola or Denny's or some of the scandals that have taken place in the past, those issues and that have come to the forefront have caused companies to take notice and change. So it's either leadership that makes a change, or it's usually a pain point. And that's where we get the call where, okay, we really have to change. And unfortunately, a lot of the organizations we're working with right now, they're experiencing that pain because people are speaking out in record numbers. People are putting out tweets. People are doing anonymous interviews with reporters. So this is, an issue that's not going to go away. I think, when we talk about Lafayette Square and some of the issues and protests, there's probably a thought that, the protests are going to go away. Well, this is an issue that's not going to go away. You're seeing more diverse groups out protesting, and, people are taking a stand now, and there's no longer fear in most cases speaking up.
And Doree, I know we talked about this very early this morning, and this is, of course, this program's going to air for a period of time. But this morning, the Washington Post has an in-depth piece about organizations such as NOW and the AAUW, American Association of University Women, who, despite being on the right side of so many issues, and despite the fact that Me Too just reached its apex in the last couple of years, have been blind to issues of racial injustice, while they pontificate importantly, but on issues regarding gender issues and discrimination. So I think one of the key things that you're saying here is that everyone needs to look at themselves, no matter what we've done, no matter what we stand for. It's really important for us to not only look with a magnifying glass at our companies, but also for us to all look in the mirror.
Yes, exactly. The Washington Post piece, it's great because it's, you're looking at laws, even looking back at like the Civil Rights Act and other laws that have benefited homogenous groups and not people of color. So even though there's a perception that a lot of these programs have benefited people of color. So that, it is an issue that I think everyone could take a moment to take a step back and use this as an opportunity to look inward. And most of us are working from home, except for people in communities of color and people in communities that have been greatly impacted by COVID. You're living in a food desert where, no, you can't just run out to the store and get something healthy. Goes to some of the points Bill raised about obesity and some of the real issues impacting the communities we work in.
Yeah, we have data to Dare's point exactly that Black and Hispanic Americans are among the most concerned about the coronavirus pandemic. But, if they didn't just lose their jobs altogether when the economy crashed in March and April. They're among the ones most likely to have to be out and about to do their jobs, to continue getting that paycheck, and essentially being exposed to the coronavirus. And we also know, and there's been a lot of data out there, that particularly the Black community has an exceptionally high rate of being exposed to the virus, and much greater mortality rates than any other community in the country. So like, it's a very clear difference in how people are dealing with things. And the other thing I would want to add in to an earlier point is that, you know, the long-term trajectory of American society has been towards more socially liberal, social equality measures. If you look at the different demographics in the American society right now, younger generations, you know, the millennials, the Gen Z, are very much, you know, by 3, 4, 5-to-1 ratio on the side of social justice, on the side of civil rights, on the side of racial equality. So an organization that doesn't embrace these topics now is going to relatively quickly find itself on the wrong side of demographics, right? So, you know, I don't think that we should be trying to tell people that this is all about doing good for society. A lot of this is about doing good for your organization long term, because if you're not doing this, you're going to find yourself on the wrong side of history in a relatively short order, and it's going to make it real hard for you to continue doing business.
And so here,
Yeah, I think you hit upon so many issues in the last several minutes. I think this notion of Chris, what you just kind of really alluded to is what companies and the country has to accept is embracing the discomfort of these conversations, and that's okay. And you know, I worked with a client, and she wrote a piece that said it's okay to not be okay, but we have to confront this, and that's going to require leadership. You know, Bill, you talked about board leadership. We've talked about senior leadership. Kurt, you talked about, well, how do you drive dramatic change? Guess what? You name the CEO of that division, who's a diverse person, who suddenly says, "Here are our goals, and here are the people who are going to be in charge of it. And are you with me? And if you are, you're going to be part of this company. And if not, then you know things are going to change here. Hop on the train and keep on going." That builds in accountability. People then see the responsibility that they have to this issue and how it affects the business and the bottom line, how it affects their communities, how it affects the way they interact with their coworkers, their friends and family. And then, you know, more importantly, and I know this is about capitalism, so we got to measure it, right? None of this happens. None of the goals we have for diversity and equity happen for improving obesity in African American communities. I've been on the board of the Kidney Foundation for years, and the rates of chronic disease for kidney disease, no less heart and diabetes, are all rampant. None of this happens without leadership accountability and measuring what are the things we're doing, how we're putting in the resources, making sure we're getting the ROI, and tracking the progress so that the line is really driving to some progress and change, and more than just a conversation. This is a time where we're more than just figureheads and titles. This is really budgets, bodies, and responsibilities.
Yeah, and we're, you know, what we're seeing too for the first time is, you know, companies embrace this. And while we talk about the ones who aren't doing it right, there are plenty of people who are doing it, you know, the right way and leading by example and making dramatic changes. I mean, I think about in entertainment, we've seen, you know, very successful artists like Lady Antebellum change their name to Lady A. The Dixie Chicks now going by the Chicks. The Washington Redskins getting rid, you know, of their name as well, because, you know, social and cultural pressure now is so high. That this isn't something that you can hide from. I mean, you know, in previous times, getting entertainers and sports engaged, you know, was an uphill climb. And you know, we've seen in Washington D.C., where I'm normally at, you know, this conversation about the Redskins name has been going on for 2 decades, and the owner Dan Snyder has resisted it every step of the way. But it really says something that now at this moment, he even had to cave into that pressure. And I think that when you have people like him who have been so reticent to change, recognizing that this moment is different from anything that we have seen in a very long time, that they're willing to make those type of big changes, that gives me hope that I think,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people will follow suit after that.
But Kurt, the point that you just raised, and we need to tell the audience, first of all, of your love of country music. So hence the number of examples that you have. But when it comes to the Washington football team, it's not as though Dan Snyder had a sudden attack of consciousness. If you look back over 2 decades, Abe Pollin changed the name of the old Baltimore, then Washington Bullets, because he felt it was the right thing to do. And there, at the time, Washington had the unfortunate leadership role as in crime statistics in the United States. He did that on his own. The Washington Redskins, Dan Snyder, will change because, to Bill's point earlier, financial pressure from FedEx and the 2 minority owners of the team. And I think one of the things that we're talking about here is, and particularly to Doree's point, and Chris, your point about where we're going, do the right things now because they're right. They will pay dividends if that's all you're looking at moving into the future. But do them right rather than wait for the crisis and have to suffer multiple quarters or potential fatal economics. And this is the moment to do it. And Neil, that gets me to the question I wanted to ask you, which I started to ask earlier. Here you are, president of the National Black Public Relations Society. I should never be able to reach you on the phone. Circuits should be dead in Dallas because your phone is ringing off the hook. And it's ringing more, as you and Doree say, but it's not like it's endless. And I can't think of a company right now that isn't trying to address pandemics and COVID and the future pandemics, an issue they largely would have ignored in the past, more or less. Certainly, if you look at insurance policies, people weren't buying pandemic insurance policies. But now they have a new reality. Your phone's not ringing off the hook. Why is that?
It goes to the sense that that one, there's a conundrum of what should we do next? How do we address this problem? Right. And so one of the ongoing conversations, and I've been in media in some way or the other for a long time, and I started doing working on diversity issues in the newspaper industry in the early 80s and the 90s, and this issue of where do we find more people like you, which I just I stammer like I am right now because I'm just appalled. I mean, ask Bill at Clark Atlanta and the AU University schools, where are they? Where do you begin? Clark Atlanta, Spelman, Morris Brown, all these other universities, HBCUs are one place you can begin. No less, thinking about, let's be real. What is your friend circle? Where do who do you hang out with? Who do you have conversations with? Who do you invite to your house? Who do you go to lunch with in your company? And if it's the same group of people all the time, then you're missing out opportunities to figure out, well, Neil, how can you help me? And I always want to help. I always want to point people to the many members of our organization who have dozens and dozens of years of experience, some of whom who worked in agencies who after 5 to 7 years felt that they had hit a glass ceiling and decided to leave the industry to start their own businesses or move into another industry because there was this continued sense as even as we meet this great moment in the country's history of a lack of innovation, creativity, and again, quite boldly to make the big move. NBC made a big move. Will Mr. Cundy work out? I'm sure he will, because he's earned every bit of his experience to take on that role. For many other companies, there's the lack of that sense that we have to find the right person who's qualified, when in fact there are cases on cases on cases where unqualified individuals have been appointed to leadership positions, been allowed to fail, and never had any accountability. But for people of color, for Blacks and Hispanics and Asians, Native Americans who end up in these roles. If we stumble, then we become a symbol for the race and hold that burden that blocked many people, as we see today, wanting to take the risk on certain individuals. So why isn't the phone ringing? Why shouldn't it be ringing more? Richard, I think there's still a lot of scratching on the head. I'm involved in organizations. The Diversity Action Alliance is trying to work with the public relations industry to get industries just to sign a pledge that they're going to commit to diversity. I'm kind of getting criticized by others who are saying, well, Neil, it doesn't have any accountability. We need to require these companies to at least hire one person in the C-suite over the next year. That's not in the statement. So these are questions that I think I'm going to continue to push folks, and I know many of my colleagues are. And I think a lot of our conversation today was, how do we push companies, executives to go ahead and make the step? The table is laid out now. The table is laid out. There's no reason to be on the fence. Just look out the window. And if you're in Washington, D.C. or Brooklyn or New York or Oakland or Seattle, just look out the window and you see what's happening in your streets. And that gives you full justification in the C-suite or the boardroom to say, now's the time.
We're approaching the top of the hour, so we're going to get last thoughts. And Dorit, looked like you were about to say something, so we'll let you start with your closing thoughts.
Yes, I wanted to just follow up on Neil's point, because it also involves creating a culture where people can succeed and thrive. There are environments where they look at the data, it's like, oh, we look pretty good compared to our industry peers, but there are environments where people aren't succeeding because of bias or because of double standards, or because one person that might be a non-minority is evaluated based on their potential, while a person of color might be evaluated on their performance. So you really have to take a hard look at your policies, update your policies, and evaluate your culture to make sure that people are teed up to succeed.
Bill, closing thoughts?
Well, what I was going to say is that I'll give an example. A Black general counsel was called to a meeting right after all the demonstrations. She showed up somewhat late to discuss what should the company do. It's a global company. And there was already a paper HR had prepared that she'd never seen. And they started discussing it, and she left the room. She was so upset. And she went to her CEO the next day and said, how could you have a strategy where I'm your general counsel, I'm on the executive committee, the only Black person, and he didn't get it. But when she talked, he did, and it got him to come around. But there's the reason things, if you're going to do culture shift, which I've done, it is a huge thing. You have to blow up the old culture. I mean, it's martial law. And there's a huge hesitancy about, well, what is this issue and how serious is it? I got a call to go into an institution, and because there had been some complaints. And what I've discovered was they wanted me to go, well, what is that person complaining about? They weren't looking at the culture. Why do I have 5 different Black people in different settings upset? And so I didn't take it. I wasn't going to go being a prosecutor against this situation. So, Richard, there's a lot of work still to be done. And I've been through changing the culture, and it's got to come from the top, and people have to let go. You're going to let some people go because there's subcultures that just won't get it. And so we're still not there. And there's a huge education the boards and CEOs still have to go through. And when you hire a consultant to help me with this, it better be somebody that's looking at the total culture. Well, you and I have discussed that one project I'm looking at with you. It's they want it to go away. It's this kind of issue, and you got to say no. It's a fundamental thing, and you got to be willing to open the kimono and hear what's really going on. So there's a lot of work to be done. It's going to take some leadership companies that will then set the example.
Chris, closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think the important thing to take away from this is that there is a clear direction of the public on all of these issues, including other issues we didn't really talk on today, like climate change, criminal justice, which we touched on briefly, economic inequality. The younger generations in America, the millennials, the Gen Z, even sort of the younger half of Gen X, have very clear preferences, and they're increasingly likely to take those preferences into account when they engage in commercial activity. It's not just someone out looking for the best product, the best service anymore. They're also taking into account, does this organization do good? Does this company do good? So it's not really optional anymore for businesses to take this into account. And I think this is actually a great forum, because a big part of the solution for this is going to be coming out of educational institutions like Wake Forest, where the next generation of leaders needs to be taught and trained that they have to take a holistic view of what leadership is and what it means to run a company. And it's not just the shareholder value, it's not just the bottom line. There's a much larger sense of equity. And if we do that, if people start doing that, that's when you're going to see a reversal of those long-term declines in trust that I talked about, because society will start working for its entirety again. And people are demanding that, are increasingly demanding that. So, you may want to sort of push back against it. You may not want to embrace it because, as Bill said, it's expensive. It's a huge undertaking, but that's a very short-term strategy. So, if you expect to have a 5-year or 10-year future with an organization, you got to address this stuff now, because in 5 or 10 years, the large majority of the public is going to be on the other side.
Kurt, I know you've got to go momentarily. So closing thoughts?
Yeah, it's just one of those times, and it's kind of rare, where the decisions that you make on social justice, it's beneficial for your business and also beneficial for your customer. This is one of the times where they're actually both aligned. The American people have made it very clear where they are on this, and if you don't catch up to the times and adapt, you will be left behind. You will be held accountable, and it's one of the things that Chris also talked about earlier in this conversation. There are more medians to express what's happening in your own culture than we've ever had before. Whether it's an employee on social media, whether it's talking to one of the 50,000 different media outlets that exist, the time it can take to take one comment that someone makes carelessly on a conference call or a Zoom call to costing you your entire business, it can happen very quick. Look at what happened with CrossFit, and the former CEO, former lead shareholder of CrossFit, Glassman, made a stupid comment, doubled down on it on a conference call. It got leaked, and he ended up losing his CEO and had to sell his shares to someone else. There is no one that's immune from this. No position, high up the totem pole, no amount of money that can shield you or protect you from what's happening right now. And so your best bet as a business person, as a company, and as a human being is to adapt and make the changes that you need to, because if you don't, it could end up costing you everything, and it can happen incredibly quickly.
Neil, last word.
We're at a point where the time for good intentions is we've passed that. It's time for action. It's every company every single day makes decisions that affect their strategy, their business, their ROI. When it comes to diversity and equity, this is a business transaction. It's a human transaction. It's a cultural transaction. It's adapting to the change in the world. And go ahead and Google the McKinsey report on diversity, and you will see that companies with diverse executives are getting greater financial performances because of that diversity. That's what we need to do. Time to take action.
Neil, it's a great closing thought. Let me do this. First of all, thank you all, and thank Wake Forest and Christina Elson, the director, who is unfortunately not able to join us today, and the Center for the Study of Capitalism. I'm Richard Levick, and if I may, in just the closing minute, I've been taking copious notes and made a list here of some things that you've mentioned in terms of to-dos. One, we're in a period of mercantile activism when companies have increased trust and there's an expectation, but also an opportunity. Two, This is a moment of change. It is historic in nature. It is not going to pass. 3, one of the most critical things you can do as an audit or red team, a 360 view, and really look at the history and the company. And Neil, to your last point, the kinds of decisions regardless of intentions. 4 is to take the long view, not just quarter to quarter. Chris, focusing on some of the financial issues you were touching on, and Bill, to your point, a company is not just its customers and its shareholders anymore. It's all about its many communities, and we have to think much more broadly. And next is that there are historic opportunities. I know, Bill, from separate conversations we've had with Clark Atlanta and others, but the historically Black colleges and universities are looking to work with companies, and not only recruitment, but long-term programs that can be win-win-win all the way around. There are clearly many more. Diverse thinking and access to the table, to the rooms where decisions are being made is critical. But I hope that's a good summary. And to Doree and Bill, Chris, Kurt, Neil, and to the entire Wake Forest community, thank you so much. I'm Richard Levick. Thanks for joining us.